Welcome to another episode of the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski. Thanks for being with us. And we've got an international flair to us today. Joining me from the far side of the Great Pond is my friend Mike Somerville, president of the UK Civil War Roundtable. How are you today, Mike?
I'm very good. I'm actually former president,
Oh,
Chris,
no, did
just
you
to,
just
just for the
did you pass
record.
the
Yeah,
baton? Oh, look at
I'm
that.
still on the committee, but I'm ex-president.
Some of those things
Just so
can
I
be
don't, just
president.
so I don't put any, just so I don't put anybody's nose out of joint.
Well, sometimes, you get president for life and you can't escape. So my congratulations to you. And we have a special guest joining us today, Dr. Christopher Brice, and he's got such an impressive resume. I'm actually going to use my little cheat sheet here. He's a British military historian, writer, and editor. He's written 3 books: The Thinking Man's Soldier, a biography of General Sir Henry Brackenbury; Brave as a Lion, a biography of Field Marshal Hugh Gough; and Forgotten Victorian Generals, for which he was editor as well as contributing a chapter on Field Marshal Robert Napier. He's also written a chapter for Professor Stephen Miller's Queen Victoria's Wars on the Abyssinian Campaign of 1867 to 68, and for Professor Ian Beckett's forthcoming book, Army, Empire, and Cinema. He established and ran from 2015 to January 2024 the Helion book series From Musket to Maxim, 1815 to 1914, during which time he saw over 40 books to publication. I feel you on that one, let me tell you. Today, works as a freelance editor, writer, and historical advisor. Chris, thanks for being with us today.
Well, pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So I was recently reading about the Trent Affair, and it always sort of poses some tantalizing questions. Kind of one of the great what ifs of the war is like, what if Great Britain had gotten involved in the American Civil War? And I think I want to talk to some guys to just sort of see like what was the state of Great Britain at the time, and that I think would help us better understand that question a little bit. And so, Chris, let me start with you.
Mm.
First of all, uh, was it likely that Great Britain would have gotten involved in the U.S. Civil War at some point, whether the Trent Affair or not?
I'm going to say no, that it is unlikely, but these things always can happen. You do have individuals either side of the pond who would quite like it to happen, or who wouldn't have been too upset if it had happened. Secretary of State Seward seems to be quite inclined towards forcing the argument with Britain. And on the British side, the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, who was could be quite bellicose at times, he wasn't that bothered either. He would have liked it. But other than those sort of small individuals, really neither side wants it. And for Britain in particular, particularly in terms of the army, it's an interesting time period. The 1860s are a period of reform, yes, but also where are we going? And also it's really a period in which there are no great tests for the British military. I mean, if you're thinking of the 1850s, we've come out of the Crimea War, the Indian Mutiny, which have both been very big tests on the military machine, have led to administrative and tactical reform. And also, we're now going into the period where in the 1870s, you'll get a lot of active service. You'll see the Red River expedition in Canada, which, although not a lot of no combat, is an important logistical affair, showing the reach and the power of the British Army and the British Empire. You'll then see the Ashanti campaign. You see the Zulu War, the Afghan wars. It's quite an active period, and you start to see the rise of the 2 great figures of the late Victorian period, Lord Wolseley and Lord Roberts. But the 1860s are a period where, with the exception of the Abyssinian campaign at the end of the 1860s, not a lot happens. Yes, there's the Maori Wars as well, but there aren't any huge I suppose I'm going to say charges, but that's perhaps not the right word. More sort of, there weren't really any great demands placed upon the army during that period. Now, obviously, if they'd get involved in the American Civil War, that would have placed a huge demand on the British Army. And it would have been interesting to see how they would have dealt with that. Now, I'm one of the camp who would say don't underestimate the British Army of the 1860s. People would look perhaps at Crimea, perhaps at the Indian Mutiny, and say, well, it's not a lot to worry about. Well, I think it could be. It would depend on a lot of factors. And we can perhaps get into that later as to how any possible conflict would have gone and what Britain could have done. But I think it's dangerous to underestimate the British Army of this period, and it's certainly dangerous to underestimate the Royal Navy of this period, although there are huge changes going on in naval warfare. We're in the dawn of the ironclad warship, but we've got a Royal Navy that has a huge number of steam-driven ships. It also has ships of the line, which, although many of them are old-fashioned guns, they also have had the addition of what we would probably call shell guns. And many of those are now the breech-loading arms drum, which you may well be familiar with, because I think both sides in the Civil War purchased them and used them. And of course, that's another interesting factor. I mean, I don't want to go too far ahead here, but that's another interesting factor. Both sides in the American Civil War use a lot of British weaponry, which in the event of any conflict would have been denied to them.
Mike, let me kind of toss it over to you. Do you think that there's a likelihood or a possibility or a sliver of a chance that Great Britain's ever going to get involved in this war?
I'm inclined to agree with Chris generally. I don't think anybody wants it. But you can always have miscalculations. And certainly if you look at the correspondence from people like Lord Lyons, the British ambassador in America, he's very concerned that, first of all, I think people tend to think of Britain will recognize the Confederacy and Britain will go to war against America. The British are concerned about it the other way around. The British are concerned about what about the Americans going to war against us? Even when right at the outbreak of the Civil War, there's a concern, is there a chance that in order to try and get a common enemy, the United States might declare war on Britain to bring the Confederacy back into the fold? Bizarre what if scenario, if you like, but nevertheless, there are people who are thinking, well, is this a possibility?
That's that's similar to the idea that the Confederate commissioners float in 1865. Like, let's team up and go after Maximilian in Mexico, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So maybe it's not so far-fetched. And then the other worry is, well, if the Confederacy win, will the Americans try and get something back and invade Canada? So the big worry that the British have with regards to America in particular is the vulnerability of Canada. And I'm sure we'll talk about it in a bit, is how would you defend Canada? Because it's really quite a difficult proposition. So it's not just a trend. There were other international incidents going on all through the 60s, through the Civil War. I think is it the Peterhof Fair, which is 1863, which is another incident at sea. There's the whole question about the Canadian acting as a refuge for raiders coming across the border, for example, like the Vermont raid in '64. So there's all sorts of possible crises that might have led to some sort of conflict escalating. I remember there have been conflicts before. There's no special relationship here. I think one British general says they both hate our guts. 1815 is still in living memory, for goodness sake.
Right. And, I think that Seward, U.S. Secretary of State Seward, he's been very bellicose against Great Britain, claiming he's going to, annex Canada's the 51st state kind of thing. He's been very anti Great Britain. So when this crisis erupts with the Trent, there is a lot of reason to think that he might use that as an excuse to do something. But I think it's really fascinating that the British are very, they bend over backwards to give him an out, we don't even need an apology. How about just an explanation? So from a diplomatic point of view, the British are really looking to not escalate this. Chris, you chuckled there for a second.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things with that is, and forgive me for putting it this way, because I think it's a similar thing that happens with the American War of Independence, is that quite a lot of Americans see it in isolation. They see it as just that. Britain has a lot of things going on in the world at that time as a global power. And to be frank, the American Civil War's a little way down the list of things it's concerned about. That has the situation in India, which obviously at the end of the Indian Mutiny, you get the end of the East India Company running India, and so Britain now has responsibility. That brings an awful lot of other issues with it. You also have China. The early 1860s see the Second Anglo-China War, which again is probably higher up the list than the American Civil War. Although realistically, the war is over by the time the American Civil War starts. But even so, there are still concerns regarding China. And also then you have the rise of Prussia in Europe. You get 1864, you know, the Dance-Prussian, Second Dance-Prussian War, or Schleswig War, if you prefer. 1866, the Austro-Prussian War, and then in 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. You know, issues like that, which are slowly boiling and bubbling earlier in the 1860s, are more concerning to Britain, along with a whole host of other issues, than perhaps what's going on in North America. Now, the issue that obviously Britain has and faces, and Michael mentioned it, is Canada, and the need to defend Canada. But that's perhaps, you know, that is an interesting point in of itself. And as Michael says, we'll probably get onto that and talk about how you would defend Canada and the ideas that they had for that.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because to me, you know, obviously it's a huge logistical issue to try to defend what is the world's largest undefended border, and you know, today. So just the amount of territory, we tend to think of Great Britain as a naval power and Canada as a giant land mass, certainly a lot of, you know, coastal area. But so what are the logistical issues that Great Britain has to consider when it's thinking about Canada, and why is that a vulnerability for them? Mike, since you brought Canada up, let me kind of pitch it over to you there.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing is, I mean, you're talking about the long land border. The border with Canada isn't even defined at this stage. And you know, out west, that 49th parallel, that's not agreed as being the demarcation line at this time. And so what we're really talking about is what at the time were Upper and Lower Canada, which is now Ontario, Quebec. You've got Nova Scotia, Newfoundland as well. That's actually a separate administration at the time. So you've got to think about, as I say, Nova Scotia as being slightly different. But obviously the big thing there is you've got the St. Lawrence, and that is the artery of Canada, if you like, because you know everything that goes into Canada and from Canada really goes down that seaway, and that's the vulnerable bit, because any you know, you've got a lateral line of communication, which is a classic military no-no. It's very easy for somebody to send a big force and break that line of communication, and that's really what the British are worried about. And there are two missions sent out to look at the defences of Canada during the period of Civil War. That's how important Britain sees it, and sees the potential threat of an American attack. And basically they come back and make some suggestions about how you might try and improve the Canadian defences, because the Canadian defences at this time are basically obsolete. The Canadian militia is not particularly highly thought of, I'm afraid to say. And as you know, with the Trent affair, what happens is you get British regular troops sent to Canada. And good quality British regular troops. I mean, it includes a Guards Brigade and things like that. But I think the big problem is there's not many of them, you know. And if you have an attack by something the size of the Army of the Potomac, the British are going to struggle. The problem from the Americans is you actually have a relatively short campaigning season. Most of the things, like most of the contemporary works I've read sort of talk about a 5-month campaigning season, basically after the thaw and before the weather starts to hit again. So you've got to get into Canada, win your battles, take the territory, and do all of that within 5 months. So the big thing the British say is, well, it's going to be a defensive war, and we're probably going to fight in entrenchments. You're not going to see big Waterloo-like field battles. It's going to be a battle. It's going to be a campaign where it looks very much like the later phases of the Civil War, where both sides are maneuvering for position around field, entrenched camps. Basically, that's the way the British tend to see this war developing in Canada.
Chris, anything you'd like to add there?
Yes, I think one point I'd raise with that is that they actually have in command of the troops in Canada the ideal man for that defensive war in the wonderful William Fenwick Williams, who, the siege of Cars might not be something that's familiar to those watching this, but during the Crimea War, Fenwick Williams defends the city of Cars with a pretty poor force. Yes, he has a lot of men, but they're not exactly the greatest troops in the world. And he manages to tie down some 25 to 30,000 Russian troops that would otherwise have been deployed elsewhere, or could have been deployed elsewhere. And his defense of Cars is something that really sort of marks him out as one of the better commanders of this time period. And he just so happens to be the commander in Canada at this point in history. So they have a good man there. They have a man who knows how to hold a position, who knows how to defend. Mike made the point about the militia, and he's absolutely right. It wasn't considered particularly great. I think it improves a little during the war in terms of what it's able to do. There's huge debates within Canada politically about expanding it to a level that would actually do some useful good, and that doesn't happen for many years afterwards. But I wouldn't write them off completely. And as you say, you have a decent sized British force being sent in there with reasonably modern equipment, with a supply system that is far better than it would have been 10 years previously, with lessons both tactically and strategically having been learnt from Crimea, but more importantly from the Indian Mutiny. Because in the aftermath of the mutiny, there is, for the first time since the 1830s, a revision of the infantry training book. And you start to see changes in how the army will actually fight, which should have been done, decades before, perhaps. But there's this recognition that modern weaponry, the rifled musket, is starting to make things different, and also the rifled artillery pieces that we're starting to see as well. So I think it's a period where, if I can put it this way, nobody really can say what would have happened, because we don't know how the British Army would have fared, because there's nothing we can compare it with really, other than maybe the Second Anglo-China War. There's nothing really we can say during this time period of this is how they dealt with. We can look later in the 1860s and say they dealt quite well with some campaigns, and many of the ghosts of the Crimea disasters seem to have been exercised. But it's difficult to say how they would have responded during the 1860s. We can say what they've got, we can say the equipment, we can say the men, and we can say who the leaders were. But how they would have performed, it's you pays your money, you takes your choice.
Yeah. And I really like the fact that you bring up the lessons learned from the Indian Mutiny, because, one of the things that I've been thinking as we've been chatting here is, George McClellan obviously had gone over as an U.S. observer in the Crimea, and had the British come over and defended Canada, would McClellan have been like, well, I know how these guys fight. I've watched them in action. But the army has evolved since he's seen them. And so, it's always hard to tell how McClellan's going to react anyway. But like, does that lend him overconfidence? Does that, and so I don't know. I'm just really interested. It's neat to kind of unpeel all these different layers, to see these different factors in play.
Hmm.
So Mike, are you thinking that if the army comes, the British Army comes to Canada and has to have some sort of presence, they have to work with the militia. That probably looks different if British involvement happens early in the war versus later in the war when the U.S. Army has gone through its own evolutions. Is it an easier time for the British to get involved earlier or later?
Uh, Absolutely, yeah. I mean, again, these what ifs, as you know, Chris, I hate what ifs.
Oh yeah.
But they're useful for this sort of discussion to try and understand, were people right not to go to war, amongst other things. So when trying to look at these what ifs, I try and go back to the contemporary evidence. And for me, the contemporary evidence on this, unfortunately, there's no Americans who really look closely at the British Army at this time. It comes after the war. It comes with people like Emory Upton, but it doesn't happen during the war, as far as I know, anyway. But what you do get, of course, is to get the British going to see the American army. And their view of the American army in 1862, and they go to the Peninsula and they go to the Army of the Potomac because that's seen as being, the best American army there is, and probably correctly. Their view is that the artillery is pretty good. The infantry is okay, and the cavalry is appalling. At a very high level, that's basically where we are.
I agree with that assessment.
So if we sort of take that back and for me and Chris may or may not agree with what I'm about to say, because I don't know what he was saying about how you evaluate the British Army at this time. The British artillery, I think, is technically probably better in the sense it's, the officers will be more experienced and more well versed. Certainly, maybe the US regular artillery would be equal, but they say the volunteers aren't quite as good, although they still drill well. So I think that would work in their favor. But the American artillery is possibly in the Army of Potomac superior. I mean, Chris mentioned Armstrong guns, and there is I think a battery of Armstrong guns sent to Canada, but a lot of the British artillery is still Smoothbore at this time. So the Americans have possibly got a slight technical edge, but I think the British possibly have a professional edge. The infantry, I think the popular conception is probably that the British are going to fight Waterloo and the Americans are going to fight World War II. Because that's how we think of the American, But I don't think as Chris said, I have a much more generous view of the British manual, infantry manual of 61. A lot of the British, if not all the British infantry, are trained to fight as light infantry. Because when you're sending people around the world, you don't know what situation they're going to have to go into. So you train them in for lots of different circumstances. So I think in man for man, I think the British infantryman is pretty good at this point in time. As Chris says, the trouble is we don't really know because they never fight an equivalent enemy. So I would say that man for man, probably the British infantryman is as good, if not better, than the Americans, even the American regulars. And they do have the advantage, particularly in 1862, that they are better armed, frankly. They're all armed with the Enfield rifle, whereas a lot of the American troops still are not armed with Enfield rifles. They're still armed with smoothbore muskets. So I think the British regiment for regiment, I think the British are probably superior to the Americans. The problem is that the Americans can bring more regiments to bear potentially. And then on the cavalry, again, I think, again, we probably tend to think of, the American cavalry all dismounted and fighting on foot, British cavalry just trying to charge with the saber. Again, I'm not sure that's true. The British light cavalry are pretty well armed with carbines at this point, and they know that they're going to have to use carbines in wooded terrain, which is what you're going to come up against in America. So I think again the British cavalry is probably in horsemanship. It's probably better than the US cavalry at this point. The problem again is going to be there's not going to be much of it. Now you move that forward 2 years, and you've got a completely different situation, I would suggest, because armament wise, the Americans have improved. You've got the breech loaders coming in, you've got repeating carbines coming in with the cavalry and all of this sort of thing. And you've got your generals have learned the lessons of the Civil War, and some of the senior regimental officers have learned the lessons of the Civil War. So I think the British Army in 1862, I think would. I'm sorry, your audience might not like me here, but I think they'll whip the Americans.
Yeah.
1864, I think you've possibly got a different situation.
Yeah.
No, I'd agree. I'd agree with that very much so. I think the only thing I'd say would be that obviously during conflicts, military technology does advance quite quickly. And one of the things I would say as well, that you think of the American army advancing during the conflict. Well, Britain had been involved in the conflict since 61, 62. I would imagine that by 64, 65, the British army would have advanced quite a lot. And British industry was still very strong at this time. It starts to decline later in the century, but it's still very strong, and it's still pushing ahead in terms of technology. So I think you've got something quite useful there. And again, something else I wanted to pick up on what Michael said was about light infantry. I mentioned that in 1859 they sort of rewrote the instruction manual a little bit, and one of the things very much they were focusing on there, one of the things that came out of the Indian Mutiny, was the use of skirmishing and light infantry. This was something that now the British Army was really starting to think about very seriously. And you find at this period of time the flank battalions of infantry regiments, who were normally the people who were meant to do the skirmishing, meant to do the light infantry work, they've now been disbanded. And so every company has to be able to do light infantry duties. So yes, it's an army that's really starting to take on light infantry. And again, I agree with the point about the cavalry. It would have been very interesting, to say the least, to see what British heavy cavalry, had it ever been deployed to American battlefields, would have been able to do. Because one of the things about heavy cavalry is it scares the living daylights out of the enemy. Because if you can imagine these big, heavy horses, if you've ever stood on a field and seen a horse charge, and you can feel it going up through you, well, imagine hundreds of them charging at you, and you're stood there with just a musket rifle to defend yourselves. Terrifying. And this is the thing, and particularly for American troops who weren't professionals, who were people who had been brought in for the conflict, this would have been something terrifying to see. And heavy cavalry of the British units, charging forward with lances and sabres. Yeah, that could have been actually, we call it the arme blanche, but it could have actually been a really effective tool on an American battlefield.
And as I'm thinking about these comparisons and contrasts between the two armies, it also kind of brings to mind to me that essentially the British Army is a stranger to the American Army, whereas the Confederate Army, you've got all these guys who served in the old army together, they'd gone to West Point, they'd served in the Mexican War together, so there was a familiarity on a leadership level and a tactical level. But this would be an entirely different entity for a United States Army to have to face, and basically start a rule book from scratch in a way that they wouldn't have to with the Confederacy. Are there lessons learned from the War of 1812 along the Great Lakes that either side would be able to consider as they're making plans?
Well, there is a plan for war with America that was constituted in the 1840s, I remember. This is the Simpson Plan during the Oregon boundary dispute. And one of the things was basically to raid across the Great Lakes with Marines and light infantry, militia, and just basically then go, raiding across. When you finish raiding, go back safely across into Canada. So that would have been something I think you would have seen, perhaps out of necessity, because it's difficult to fight a completely defensive war. you need to try and get some sort of offense in, even if it's only little raids like that. Even in something like a siege, you often see a besieged army try and break out and attack the enemy lines. It would be similar if you look at Canada as being under siege. There'd have to be some outlet, there'd have to be some way of fighting back. You just couldn't operate entirely on the defensive. So there, but yes, there probably would have been raiding parties like that. You've also got as well that with the Royal Navy, and with the greatest respect to the Union Navy of this time period, the Royal Navy wants to go somewhere, it's going somewhere. If it really wants to, it can bring enough force to make it happen. So there's the possibility of raiding anywhere up and down the seaboard if it really wants to. And we then get into the realms of what would a conflict look like? Yes, the Americans may well invade Canada, but do you then get a complete naval blockade of the Union? Do you get any operations along the Pacific coast? I know it's a long way to go, but bear in mind, Britain does have possessions in China and in India, has a great vast reserve of manpower there, along with naval shipping, that it could potentially undertake an operation again across the Pacific. Whether it would or not, another matter entirely, but it's a possibility. And then you open up yet another front. And I think that's the big thing I would say about any British war against the Union, is it's just going to open more and more fronts. And one of the basic tenets of war is fight on as few fronts as you have to. If they start a war with Britain, means you'll be fighting firstly in Canada. You might have naval raiding parties. You may well have something on the west coast, on the Pacific coast. There are many different kettles of fish that start being looked into at that point.
Yeah. And
I think
Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, Chris has raised 2 or 3 points there. I was going to raise if they weren't otherwise. So yeah, I mean, you said about 1812, Chris, and I think, if you like, 1812 is the sort of blueprint, if you like, for how this war would have turned out.
Yeah.
I think, you're going to have a Canadian conflict, and it happened in 1812. And possibly a little bit like it was in 1812, that's going to be pretty much of a stalemate. As I say, it's a limited campaigning season. Yes, you're going to get some maneuver, but a lot of the armies are just going to be entrenched. So there's very limited possibilities of a really decisive battle. But then you've got everything else going on. So, I don't think we're going to see the Grenadier Guards charging up next to Pickett at Gettysburg. It's just not going to happen. But what about naval expeditions against against the American seaboard, as Chris says? That's what happened in 1812.
Yeah.
Yes. And in 1862, I think those sort of raids are feasible. As Chris says, if you look at the American Navy in 1862, it is not a patch on the Royal Navy. I'm sorry. The Royal Navy could probably break the blockade with absolute impunity in 1862. The Pacific one is interesting, because I thought I was the only person who come up with that. I don't know if you're aware of it, because it's in the book it's in my book about British lessons in the Civil War. There's a general called Linton Simmons, and in 1865 makes a piece about how would we fight America, and one of his suggestions is you land Indian troops in California.
Yeah.
Now, if you'd have suggested that to me about 15 years ago, I would have said it was complete hogwash and absolute fantasy generalship. But it's something that a British general is actually suggesting in 1865.
Yeah.
And as Chris says, the British are fighting in Japan, the British are fighting in New Zealand. The British go to send ships off South America, in the Pacific South America in the 1870s. So British sea power in the Pacific is not to be sneezed at. And we know from the work of Kevin Waite, who's a Californian historian working over here in the UK, California is vulnerable there are a lot of Confederate sympathizers in California. So the idea of a British fleet sailing into San Francisco Harbor and taking over Southern California is not as far-fetched as you might think.
Right.
So there's all sorts of things that could happen if you once you start to extend the war. What I would say about the Royal Navy is I think that again it's timing again, isn't it? In 1862, yeah, absolutely, the Royal Navy would sail around the American coast, I think, with pretty much impunity. If you think about a war starting in 1864, it's a little bit different because the American Navy is so much more powerful. Now, I think picking up something that Chris said earlier, you can't forget the fact that British shipbuilding is still way ahead of American shipbuilding at the time. So in a prolonged war, the Royal Navy is going to regain that supremacy potentially. But if you just think about a war in 1864, and I think the problem is when people compare the fleets, they often pretty much compare the fleets in 1864. I think the British would much more struggle to get into an American harbor. And if they try and break the blockade and there is an American ironclad fleet nearby, it's quite dangerous, I think, for the British fleet. And again, something Chris said earlier, you've got to remember that this is not happening in isolation. You've also got to consider the European balance of power. So the US Navy as a risk fleet is actually something the British are quite worried about, I would suggest, in 1864.
Okay. So then I want to dive
No,
into
I would agree with that.
Go ahead. Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
I was just going to say I would agree with that. I think one of the things I'd say about the fleet of this time period is that many of the British battleships, ships of the line, whatever you want to call them, were that time frame where the terminology is starting to change. They are still old wooden ships that have been converted with steam power, screws, whatever. They've had breech loading guns put on them. They are now carrying guns that fire shells rather than the old-fashioned cannonball. So yeah, you've got this developing period. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that they are all suddenly obsolete by 1864. I think they've still got a role to play. The other thing as well is that it would, obviously by 1864, you've changed how it's going to be fought, because the Royal Navy is still going to command the sea, but it's not going to be able to operate in the coast with the impunity that it could in 61, 62, because of the Union ironclads. But obviously, as we know from our history of that period, that when the ironclads start wandering away from the coast, then things start to go a bit awry, don't they?
Right.
Famously so. So again, it would just be an evolving of the way in which the war would fought. And something else Michael said, which made me laugh, was Linton Simmons. He mentioned in his writing on that. I didn't know that, but I know of Linton Simmons. He's the governor of the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, one of the great thinkers of the period. And he's actually the guy who encouraged my man Brackenbury, who I wrote the biography of, to start his literary career. So yeah, I'm not at all surprised that Simmons is thinking of something like that. And you say unleashing an Indian army. Well, actually, the Indian army is pretty darn good. If you pick the right units and if you pick the right generals, and there's some good. This was one of the things I was thinking when I was about this, doing this interview, was thinking of, would they send out any additional commanders to take over the command in an event of war? And when you start looking at the better British commanders of this period, pretty much all of them are in India. So you're talking of James Hope Grant, you're talking of Robert Napier, Hugh Rose, Outram, people like that. They are all Patrick Grant, even, although he's getting on a bit by this stage. They're all people who are based in India and have experience of India. Give a couple of them an Anglo-Indian army and allow them to sail across the Pacific. They could be causing a lot of trouble in 61, 62. And at the very least, they're going to require the Union forces to deploy a lot of troops out west. And this is the thing, it's a large army, the Union Army. It grows considerably. but it's got a finite number. You know, if it's got troops in Canada, it's got troops on the West Coast, logically, therefore, there are fewer troops facing the Confederacy. And what happens then? You know, it's one of those things that I think you need to consider about any British intervention in the American Civil War, is it just makes it a much bigger conflict and puts far more demands upon the Union forces than it otherwise faces.
How does that also play out on the British side? I mean, you know, when we think about the Victorian Empire at this time, or a little later in the century, where the sun never sets on the British Empire, but that also means that there've got to be troops garrisoned at all of those places. Leadership is spread out. So suddenly there's an extra conflict among many of these other kind of hotspots. Is the British Army able to respond in an elastic sort of way to something like that?
I mean, yes. I don't want to say yes and no, but yes and no. Because I think one of the things you're looking at the British Army in this period, you'll be talking about an army of 210, 220,000 men. 65 to 70,000 of them are stationed in India, pretty much permanently. That's the established level that they feel needs to be kept of British troops in India in the post-mutiny world. So suddenly you've cut down, you know, your force. You know, the British would have struggled to put much more than 60 to 80,000 men into the American Civil War. There were plans that basically they would empty the British Isles of military troops, possibly the exception of Ireland, and rely largely on the volunteers. And there's a reasonably sized volunteer force at this period, about 130,000, which there's always this theory, we can rely on them for home defense. Well, could you? There are question marks over their quality. You know, they're weekend warriors, really. They do occasional bits of training. But one of the things that people are starting to say in the 1860s is that actually the volunteers are in a better position to fight a conflict, because with now more modern weaponry, with rifled muskets, they don't have to stand in big disciplined formations. They can hide and fire. They can work in light infantry roles, which lends much more of an appeal to the volunteer soldier. You know, all he needs to know is how to load his gun, how to fire it, and how to aim. I know that sounds a bit simplistic, but that's more of what you can get away with a volunteer now than having them in big disciplined columns and, you know, lines and marching in formation and, you know, fighting in that way. So the volunteers probably could have been left largely to defend Britain, and you could have taken most of the British Army out of there. But I think you'd needed to have done that to put 60 to 80,000 men into North America.
And
I think I'm sorry, I think I'm right in saying they do that to a limited extent during the Crimean War, don't they, Chris? That they take militia units to garrison places like Malta and things like that. Am I right in that?
Yes, you are right, and they do it again in the South African War at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, where you get some of the I'm trying to think what it is now. There's some of the volunteer units of the British Army that are not supposed to see service overseas do get deployed overseas because they stretch rules. They include Malta suddenly becomes part of the British homeland, as does Gibraltar, and people are allowed to volunteer for service. Well, they volunteer for service because they're paid a few extra shillings for their time, and so yeah, you get a huge deployment of that. And this is the thing about the volunteers; they can be used to plug the gaps and allow the regular army to go and actually do the fighting. And again, as we've mentioned already, don't forget the Indian Manpower Reserve, which becomes far more important as the century goes on. Indian troops see a surprising amount of service outside of India. something that's largely forgotten today.
I want to ask about that. And this is like totally in the weeds, and I'm way off the rails with speculation and just kind of wondering aloud here. But so if you had Indian troops who were brought to the United States to engage in conflict with a war that involved Confederate independence, and I don't know the dynamics of the Indian mutinies or anything like that, but are there concerns for British officers thinking about this idea of independence and what it might mean for the troops who are fighting? Again, I'm just sort of spitballing here.
I think it would be quite a radical concept for some British officers. Yes, I mean you have this concept of civilized wars and savage wars. You know, if we're fighting people who are not white skinned, that's a savage war, and then a civilized war is against people who look like us. I mean, Britain does deploy Indian troops outside of India. They deploy them into Persia, and more importantly, as Chris says, they deploy them into Africa. They deploy them into Abyssinia,
Sudan.
deploy them into the Sudan. But they don't until 1914. They don't deploy them into Europe. So there is a cultural barrier, I think, to actually, you know, Linton Simmons is really thinking outside the box there when he talks about doing that. But so I think there would be some people who would say, "Oh, we can't do that," because what if they actually beat white people? Let's be really brutally honest about this.
Right. Well, and then of course, then that undermines some of the ideas of the Confederacy too, right? So I mean, just some of these cultural things are really kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, two points. Sorry, Michael.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm going to say 2 points I'd say on that briefly. Is firstly, I think they'd be very selective about what Indian troops they'd use. I think you'd have Sikhs, you'd probably have Gurkhas, maybe some Pathans, but it would be very much what would become known as the martial races in India. So, but I think you'd see an Indian force backing up a British force, like in the Second Anglo-China War. You have a mixture of British Army units from India and Indian Army units. So you'd see that combination. I think any force that was sent across to fight in America would be of that nature. So that's the first thing I'd say on that. I was going to make another point, which I can't remember now. But I think in terms of if you're fighting over there and fighting against, in inverted commas, whites, you might come up against the same issue that happened in the South African War, whereas, as Michael and myself have just said, that, you know, they were happy to deploy them in the Sudan, in Abyssinia, in China, the so-called savage wars. But when you get to the South African War, fought against the Boers, fought against white people, they will not deploy the Indian Army. They employ officers, white officers from the Indian Army. They employ British troops stationed in India, and there are actually a few Indian hospital units sent over and things like that. But they do not deploy Indian troops in South Africa. You may have found the same. I mean, you would have found the same opposition in 1860, 1861. I would think it might be slightly different in terms that I think it would be more about their trustworthiness in the aftermath of the mutiny, more than the racial ideology, which I think becomes more prevalent as the century goes on. It is very interesting. If you do look at the Indian Army during this period, there is a way in which Victorian Britain becomes, well, today we'd say racist, more racist. It grows, this feeling of cultural and I suppose cultural and national superiority, that the white is superior to the black African or to the Indian, and that grows, I think, during this time period far more than it is. It's there in the earlier period, it's there in the Georgian period, it's there in the early Victorian period, but I think it becomes more sort of perhaps acceptable in the late Victorian period, as we've got this empire that is growing and evolving, you know, the civilizing mission as it becomes known, it becomes more acceptable. And so I think whilst there would certainly have been those who said, oh, we can't deploy Indian troops against white troops in 1860, I don't think it would have been as strong as it was during the South African War, when it was just, no, we're not doing it, absolutely not, out of the question, which was a tactical mistake, you know, in my opinion, a tactical mistake on the part of the British. Deploy a few units of Sikhs and Gurkhas up against the Boers. It would have been messy, but I tell you who's winning in it, and it's not the Boers.
So I want to go back.
I think that's an.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Go ahead,
no, go ahead, Chris. Ask your question.
No.
I was going to say, I think that's an interesting. I absolutely agree. You'd be deploying probably the best troops for the Indian Army as well. And you see this again if you look at the Boer War. Troops who are deployed from India, and these are British, you know, white troops being deployed from India. They are far more effective, generally speaking, than the troops who come in straight from the UK, because they've got battle experience.
Yeah.
And that's what I think you've got to think about in the American Civil War, particularly if you're talking about 1862. You've got people who've been in the army for half a dozen years coming into Canada. You know, it's a 12-year period of enlistment in the army. So, you know, the average is going to be 6 years. So you're going to have relatively battle-hardened troops in 1862. Again, that's going to change a bit by 1864, when the Americans are going to be battle-hardened as well. The other interesting thing is Chris was saying about the quality of the generals, and the quality of the generals, particularly from India. Again, you know, because of the fact they've got experience of war. But there is a problem if you're deploying 60,000 men. Is the British don't deploy 60,000 men during this period. You know, that they're going to have the same learning curve of deploying and maneuvering big armies to some extent that the Americans have got.
Yes.
Yeah. And they've got an ocean over which to try to figure out those logistics too.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, you've hit on one of the perennial problems of the British Army, which is higher command leadership. You know, we have plenty of generals who are good at leading division-sized forces, brigade-sized forces. When you start talking about army corps and multiple army corps, the list of men during the Victorian period who really have the capability of doing that is very small indeed. And, you know, with the greatest respect to all those concerned at this time period, I'm not sure there is one. But again, we don't know because they never got the opportunity. But I don't look at, I mean, I could throw you out a wild card name of someone who I think might have actually done a decent job doing it, which would be Sir James Scarlett. I don't know, that's a name that Michael knows, but Crimea War, he leads the successful charge of the Heavy Brigade at Balaclava. He's largely an administrative man, mostly in terms of logistics and deployment and things like that. But he's very sensible in the Crimea, that he surrounds himself with a staff and with commanders who have all seen battle experience, most of them in India. And so any lack of battlefield experience he has is made up for by them. And when you look at Scarlett, I mean, you know, it's a wild card, I know, but I think you sort of see someone there who might have been able to adapt. I mean, the other guy who is possible for this, and it's far too early for him, would be Robert Napier. He's too young. They're not going to give him an army at this stage. 10 years later, yes, they would. Most certainly they would. If you look at the Eastern Crisis during the 1870s, Napier's commanding the British forces. That's why they give him the relatively obscure post of Gibraltar, so that he's on hand to be deployed anywhere around the world as soon as, you know, it's needed. So Napier would be leading this a generation later, 10 years later, but not at this time period. He's still too junior. I mean, I think I'm not even sure he's a major general. I think he might have a local rank of major general because of his command responsibility, but I think in the British Army, he's still only a colonel.
It's kind of interesting though, because as we're talking about just the sky size and scope, just like Northern and Southern generals sort of had to figure that out. There's a learning curve. I mean, it seems like the British Army would also, just because of the size and scope, they've got the military experience, but not on the scale that this conflict probably would involve. So they're
The only thing
probably
I'd say,
suffering some of those same sort of learning issues.
yes, the only thing I'd say to that is that they had a very good example in the Crimea of a few years before of how not to do it.
Okay.
So hopefully they'd learn whatever they did in the Crimea, do the opposite, and you might work out all right.
Right.
But yeah, there is a perennial problem throughout this period. Even when you look at the better generals, the Wolseleys, the Roberts, the Kitcheners, they never really have the opportunity to command great armies in conventional battles. I mean, obviously, Roberts and Kitchener command enormous armies by comparison for the era, or certainly in terms of British Army, in South Africa, but it's not conventional warfare. The closest you get to a conventional battlefield after the Crimea and the mutiny is Egypt in 1882. But even then, you're not talking about an enormous force. I'm trying to think. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think about 30, 40,000, is it, Michael?
I was going to say, so I think it's about 30,000 on the Egyptian side and probably about 20,000 on the British side at Tel Okabir, but
Yeah,
I wouldn't like to be quoted on those. I can't.
No, you could well be right.
It's certainly that sort of order. It's much smaller than what we think about. You know, the climactic battles of the Civil War.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think
that's
all
the big
all
war.
armies.
That's the big war. You know, so
yeah.
I want to back up to something we touched on just a little while ago, but I want to make sure it doesn't kind of escape the net here. Since we've talked a lot about the Navy, how much of an issue is ironclad technology for the British Navy? I mean, they've got an ironclad of their own, a couple more coming off the line there in 1863. But if they get involved in the war in 1862 and suddenly American ironclad technology appears, is that an issue or not?
I mean, yes, it is. But I think, as I was saying earlier, really we're talking about American ironclads being coastal.
Right.
What we'd call traditionally call a brown water or a green water navy, rather than a blue water navy. So it might have reduced Britain's ability to fight close inshore, but in terms of high seas, the Royal Navy is still dominant. I mean, we're talking about HMS Warrior, obviously, and ships of that nature. Warrior's not technically available until 62, because although it's launched earlier than that, during its trials, they find out a few issues. And she goes into, I wouldn't say dry dock, but certainly goes in to have some modifications made in the early part of 62. So it's mid 62, I think, before Warrior would be available. And her sister ships would be coming in 64. I think you'd have had enough if you use them as your, I don't want to use the word battering ram, because ramming in naval terms means literally bang. So I don't mean it in that sense. But if you use them as your guard, your foreguard, your first advance, then the backup of the rest of the fleet should be sufficient to make the day secure. But you would talk about then having to deploy the pride and the very best of the Royal Navy to North America, which is something that, you know, would be a decision that they'd have to take with the various implications thereof. I mean, the great advantage Britain has during this period of the American Civil War is that it doesn't have to worry about the French. You know, because the French, somewhat to the British surprise, rather are on our side. They're very anti-union as well. And you know, there are British politicians who are expecting the French possibly to be more favourable towards the Union, and under Napoleon III, they're very much, you know, they aren't. And so Britain doesn't necessarily have to worry as much about keeping forces, naval, military, or otherwise, at home, because frankly, in the 1860s, France is the only fear Britain has in that regard, in terms of the home isles. I mean, the German threat has not yet risen. Russia's not really in a position to do anything. So really, in terms of the defence of the British Isles and the British Channel, etc., you're talking about the French alone, and the French are saying, no, you go ahead, we're all right, we're not going to get involved. Then it does give them quite a bit of freedom.
Yeah. So let me ask you guys, just as we start to head into the home stretch, one of the assumptions people make when we kind of talk about the Trent incident and possible British intervention is, well, of course, King Cotton is going to bring them in, but oh gosh, slavery is going to keep them out. And so this, the juxtaposition between the slavery issue, the cotton issue, manufacturing, what's your take on those issues? Mike, do you mind if I start with you?
Well, it's a divisive issue. It's a divisive issue in Britain as much as it is in America, almost. So yeah, you've got trading interests who are very keen to make money out of the conflict as much as anything else. But they're the same interest to some extent that we're making money out of the cotton trade. But interestingly enough, the actual manufacturing centres which suffer the common famine, they're actually more pro-union. So you've got Liverpool, which is pro-Confederate to a huge extent, but you've got Manchester, the other end of the Manchester Ship Canal, which is pro-union. It's got a statue of Abraham Lincoln up in one of its squares. So I think that you've got if you like, the conservative with a small c element in Britain sort of favors the Confederate because they think their lifestyle's more similar to ours. They're more aristocratic, and such like. And then you've got the radical politicians in Britain, look at America as being the model for what they want to be a democratic Britain. And so there are and it's seen at the time. I mean, people talk about it as being Cavaliers and Roundheads with echoes of the British Civil War, of the English Civil War. So people at the time see this conflict as being important and being resonant for English politics and also for the English economy. I mean, we talked earlier on about why would Britain get involved? My feeling is that Britain didn't need to get involved. It actually gets most of what it wants strategically without actually fighting.
Yeah.
I
agree. I think war would have to have been forced on Britain. I don't think it's declaring war. I think Britain wouldn't declare war. It would have to have been pushed to a situation where, in effect, the Union forces invade Canada. I think that's the only thing that really starts a conflict, from my point of view. In carrying on in terms of those points, you mentioned King Cotton. Well, obviously, this is the period in which the British start to look away from America and start looking to Egypt and to India for cotton supplies, and that does the British Empire an awful lot of good, actually, because these are places we're trading with. I mean, Egypt's a little bit iffy in terms of whether you count it as part of the British Empire. It's not technically, but it is in practical terms. We're getting stuff from our own colonies rather than getting it from outside the empire, which is a great advantage for Britain. The slavery issue. Now, this is the great anti-slavery abolitionism is the great cause célèbre of Victorian society, particularly in the later period. Britain gets itself involved in a lot of things that it would rather not have been involved in because it's fighting slavery. On the very west coast of Africa, east coast of Africa, in the Sudan, wherever, there are issues about slavery there which are heavily influencing British political and consequently military policy. And I think that's the big issue with the Confederacy. I mean, almost to the point where you could say that if slavery had not been an issue in the American Civil War, I would raise the percentage likelihood of Britain getting involved quite considerably. Because I think that's one of the big factors that politically, that's going to be hard to sell to the British people. So yeah, that I think is a huge factor in why Britain isn't more inclined towards war. It's not the reason it doesn't go to war, but it's a reason why it's not more inclined to go into the American Civil War.
So, of course, Great Britain doesn't get involved, but Mike, you've written a book that really talks about how it's still a real important learning lesson for the British Army, the British Navy, a book, Bull Run to the Boer War, how the U.S. Civil War changed the British Army, that you have written. So tell us big takeaways for Great Britain because of this conflict.
Yeah, so I mean, people have looked before at what the British Army learned from the Civil War, and I think Chris was saying that the British Army is really in a period of flux, really, between the Crimea and maybe 20 years following the Crimea, I guess. Really sort of changed the way in which the British Army operates, in I would say, and I think the Civil War is a very, very important part of that. So we see a radical change in tactics. We see a lot of different armaments coming in. We see a huge changes in the way that technology is assessed. You see even very basic things like teaching people how to shoot. You don't really have to teach someone to shoot a musket. You have to train someone to use a rifle, because otherwise you don't get any benefits from it. So even though what we would consider to be very basic things, they come into the army during this period. You get the start of serious work in the Staff College and educational movements and things like that. So there's a lot of things that the Civil War influences in the army. And I think it also does influence some of that strategy that we've talked about as well. In terms of Britain starting to think about, what it means to be a global power in some respects.
And if folks want to get your book, how can they do that?
It's available through Amazon or any other good bookshops. Published by Helion, which is not in Chris's series, but it was published by Helion. So we've got a common link there as well. We can plug Chris's work again.
So before we wrap up, any final thoughts either of you'd like to conclude our conversation with? Chris?
No, I think we've covered many of the issues. I would just simply say that I don't think it was ever likely that Britain was going to go into the Civil War unless it was forced. It would have to have been something that made it feel it had to go in, whether that was a threat to Canada, whether that was an actual invasion of Canada. There would have to have been something fairly significant to push it over the edge. Because other than that, really, British military policy of this period is to keep out of conflict wherever possible, because we've got enough going on in the empire to keep us busy.
Right.
And it's a small army. It's a volunteer army, so it hasn't got huge manpower resources. It does have the advantage it doesn't have a European land border, so it can have that policy of a volunteer army. It doesn't have to have conscription, which would have been very difficult politically in Britain at this time. So, yeah, they don't want to have anything that's going to change the policies that they've got. And the American Civil War would very much have done that. So, yeah, more than happy to keep out of it.
Very good. Mike, any final thoughts?
No, absolutely. I think it was down to the Union to decide whether Britain went to war, and they made the right decision as well.
Right. Why pick an extra fight, right?
Yeah.
Mike, Chris, I've enjoyed the chance to chat with you guys today. You've given me a lot to think about, which is why I was hoping we could get together. So thank you both very much.
Been a really good discussion, Chris. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, great fun.
I'm Chris Bukowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.